Hi, everyone. Welcome to my presentation on executive compensation and social justice. In this presentation, I'll talk about how we got where we are today, the consequences for social justice. Is this just a US problem? We'll look at a case study, Southern Company, and we'll talk about where we go from here. As you all know, income inequality is one of the biggest social justice challenges we face. The accumulation of wealth in just the hands of a few has massive implications for the economy and the way our society functions. The dramatic rise in executive pay is symbolic of many of the deeper underlying problems that we face. Extractiveness, greed, arrogance, short-term thinking, the financialization of the economy, a lack of transparency and accountability, perverse incentives, irresponsible risk management, and in some cases, flat-out corruption. Many of you can probably guess what this graph represents. You got it. It's the CEO pay ratio to the median salary of an employee at that firm, and it's hovering around 300 to 1. Another aspect of this that I won't really touch on today, but it's important to mention, is when I'm talking about CEOs, I'm talking about white males. There's only about 4 Black CEOs in the Fortune 500 and only 32 female CEOs. As you can see here, since 1980, CEO compensation has risen over 900%. Real wages for someone with median income in this country has essentially been flat when adjusted for inflation. We got here largely as a result of the deregulation of the Ronald Reagan era and the greed is good mentality. However, it was under a Democratic president that one of the most significant policy decisions of recent history was made. Here, President Clinton is seen signing the repeal of Glass-Steagall. That had enormous consequences for the economy. However, the legislation I'm referring to is in 1993 when he signed a bill reforming the tax code, capping the deductibility of CEO salaries at $1 million. However, he left in place a massive loophole for performance-based pay. Bill Clinton's 1993 law simply didn't have the intended effect. The S&P 500 rose dramatically during the first decade, and it had so many loopholes, one compensation consultant said, even Forrest Gump could think 5 ways around it. Why didn't this work? These performance-based pay loopholes were vague and not transparent. Take, for example, earnings per share or operational revenue, 2 metrics that companies might use. How much earnings? How much revenue? These details are worked out in private by the compensation committee for the company. And corporations face little risk of legal problems or audits for not really following the spirit of the law. Here are some examples. Bell South had an individual achievement of personal commitments, whatever that means. Dell, customer satisfaction, we're not sure what that means. And at AES, maintaining a goal, performance goal of maintaining a fun workplace. They measured that simply through a survey. Southern Company is another example, which we'll come to a little bit later. When all else fails, companies can simply forego this tax deduction and pay executives whatever they want. As we can see, the shift to performance-based pay has created terrible incentives for CEOs to focus on the quarterly results and the stock price rather than the long-term success of the company. It's also caused unethical behavior. 30% of respondents of a survey of CEOs reported that their compensation plan created pressure for them to violate the law. Globally, the US is the leader in this trend, but it is definitely a global trend. In the UK and France, legislation has been put forward that makes Say on Pay binding. Say on Pay is a shareholder resolution in which shareholders have a chance to vote up or down on the structure that the compensation committee provides. In the US, this Say on Pay legislation is non-binding. It's simply an advisory vote. This is also new and was passed as a rule after the Dodd-Frank legislation was passed by Congress. Another rule that the SEC recently has implemented is a transparency law requiring that companies put forward the ratio of CEO pay to the median average salary, the ratio we showed earlier. Say on Pay is not a silver bullet. Some studies recently have shown that shareholders are basing these votes not on some ideals about what they think should be the right compensation structure, but rather the company's stock price. So it's reinforcing that same perverse incentive for management to focus on the short-term stock performance rather than the future of the company. So now we get to the case study of Southern Company and power utilities. This is an example of executive compensation gone terribly wrong with very real social justice implications. As many of you know, utilities are regulated monopolies. That means that they're regulated by public utility commissions who make sure that demand can be met and that customers are charged a reasonable rate. And the utilities get a guaranteed rate of return on their investments. In the past, utilities, they needed to raise money from investors and bondholders, and they could then recover those borrowing and project costs from customers. Recently, however, starting in South Carolina and spreading to 11 other states, state legislators have adopted new rules known as advanced cost recovery, where utility companies no longer need to get investors and bondholders on board. They pretty much borrow the money directly from the customers. This has unlocked an incredible amount of new construction and reckless spending. The South Carolina Post and Courier called this a, quote, all-you-can-eat buffet of customer cash and taxpayer-funded subsidies. And in the South, we've seen over $80 billion in new projects proposed. A lot of these projects have had terrible cost overruns and scheduling delays, and many of them have not even been finished. Yet customers are on the hook for these costs. Here are some examples. Kemper Clean Coal Power Plant, Southern Company, originally $1.8 billion, now $7.5 billion. It was supposed to be a clean coal plant. Now it's just a regular gas plant. Also, the Vogtle Nuclear Plant has been $12 billion and is way, way over schedule. And in South Carolina, the VC Summer Nuclear Plant, they've spent more than $12 billion, it says 9 here, $12 billion, and it's never actually going to get finished. But real people are paying the costs. You can look here and see what that means for actual people in the South Carolina community. At Southern Company, shareholders have really started to take notice of these cost overruns and what it means for executive compensation. They point out that Southern Company claims that it links pay and performance to align the interests of executives with shareholders. No talk here, of course, of the ratepayers. It's simply investors, shareholders. However, the Kemper plant, which has been a total disaster for Southern Company, was simply conveniently excluded from the earnings per share metric so that Tom Fanning, their CEO, could earn that 40% bonus. 40% of his bonus is for earnings per share, as you can see here. And that resulted in $700,000 greater bonus in the year 2016. So where do we go from here? The 2017 tax bill actually did end this performance-based pay loophole in order to raise more revenue for them to cut corporate taxes. However, it's unlikely to really make a dent in CEO growth. The peer practices of how CEOs are paid are simply too strong at this point. The Bill Clinton law has essentially established a certain minimum that self-respecting CEOs for major companies are willing to accept. And now it's like the luxury tax in baseball. It's not stopping the Yankees and Dodgers from getting the players they want. Americans clearly do want change across the spectrum. 74% believe that CEOs are paid too much, and about half of Americans think that the government should directly intervene to do something about it. Here are some of the things that they've proposed. Increasing taxes on CEO compensation, setting a strict limit on the dollar amounts that CEOs can receive, either relative to the worker or an absolute limit, and also banning the use of stock options and equity compensation packages. There are many other legislative and regulatory fixes that have been thrown around. There's an entire menu of policy options available. However, ultimately, I think this problem will not get better without deeper changes in corporate culture and leadership and the way that organizations work. It's up to our generation to really make a difference and change this culture. Thanks a lot. This has been my presentation on executive compensation. If you'd like to read further on any of the stories that I've mentioned, here are the links, and I'm happy to send them around. Thanks so much.